My name is Trebor Tichenor, Trebor, Tichenor, a ragtime historian. Well, the most popular style of music played at that time was ragtime. And the city fathers were afraid if they put ragtime on the official program that it would put all the other classical concerts in obscurity. It would take over too much. So if you wanted to listen to ragtime, you had to go down to what was called the Pike, which was the entertainment district of the fair. You might catch a few cakewalk tunes played by the Sousa Band. You know, that's about as far as you could go on the official fair program. There was at least one Chicago publisher that had like 6 or 8 booths set up on the fairgrounds hawking his music, so we know that he had to have demonstrators demonstrating the music there at the World's Fair. So there was probably a little more ragtime played on the fairgrounds than you might think, you know.
And perhaps more than fair organizers would.
Yes, I think so, right. Well, the first fair at which any kind of syncopation was heard was probably the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. But the ragtime hadn't really come into its own yet, and we really don't know to what extent syncopated music was heard at that fair. It was a little bit too early. So in 1904 World's Fair here, ragtime was in full bloom. So this was the first important exposition in which you could have heard ragtime, at least here on the Pike. Ragtime was America's first original popular music form, and it surfaced in the mid-1890s and went almost to 1920. And it evolved into a piano art where you had a syncopated melody played against an even, steady rhythm. That's basically what ragtime is. Of course, there are ragtime songs, ragtime instrumentals, cakewalks, and it took the country by storm. It was an established craze by 1900 in this country. Well, ragtime was a strong influence really on most American popular music that followed. It established the idea of a continuously syncopated melody, and syncopation is a standard element of American popular music. And it lent great form and discipline to the jazz pioneers, such as Jelly Roll Morton, who drew a lot on the old rags to write their own music, and brought a lot of formal principles of good music into American music. Mm-hmm. Well, in the middle and late 19th century, the most popular music, anything approaching a pop tune, would have been probably something by Stephen Foster. These things you hear mostly in the old Western movies and the Western series, but the Foster tunes, and it was Victor Herbert was very popular writing light opera. There was a lot of variety in music, and which actually continued along with ragtime's development. But I think Stephen Foster is probably the most important pop composer, if you want to call him that, before ragtime.
Other than ragtime, then, what would have been played in 1904? What would have been the most common music that people would have heard, and performed by who?
Well, Sousa is probably the best example, because Sousa was always very sharp about what to program to please his audiences. So you would hear some light opera pieces, light classical pieces, intermezzos, and of course his original marches. And then he was smart enough to feature some of the popular cakewalks of the day, so those were syncopated, so the public would hear some syncopation, some of the ragtime.
What other types of groups would have been playing at the fair, do you think?
Well, I really can't say.
Okay.
Outside of Sousa, it's been such a focal point of the fair. Just traditional string groups were very, very popular at the time. Any type of sheet music you see, there are all sorts of arrangements for various string groups. So mandolin bands and various things like that we don't hear anymore today. Yeah.
Now, what about Joplin, Scott Joplin, and the fair? What's the connection there?
Scott Joplin's involvement in the 1904 World's Fair was probably nothing more except commemorating it with the Cascades. There's a persistent tale that he played piano at the fair, but there's no evidence of this. In fact, he's in the Sedalia, Missouri city directory in 1904. So we don't think he was spending much time in St. Louis. Okay, the Cascades was the waterfall exhibit that was right below Festival Hall, which was the center of the fair, and right near the entrance to the fairgrounds. and electrically lit at night, so it was quite spectacular. And it's a common image you see on a lot of World's Fair souvenirs. And Joplin used that to commemorate the fair.
Now, who else was an innovator maybe in that time period in 1904 for ragtime in St. Louis, and maybe if people didn't hear it on the Pike, where else would they have heard it?
True ragtime aficionados would have gone to the Rosebud Bar at 22nd and Market Streets, and this was owned and operated by Tom Turpin. And Turpin was an important pioneer of ragtime in St. Louis. He was playing some sort of syncopated piano as early as 1892, and he opened his own place that year on Targee Street. And his first published rag, called the Harlem Rag, was the first rag by a black composer to be published in the United States. It was published here in St. Louis. So he really he set the standards for the earliest good piano playing, ragtime piano playing in St. Louis. He kind of laid the groundwork for Scott Joplin. And Scott Joplin moved here by 1901, along with publisher John Stark, who had brought out the Maple Leaf Rag in Sedalia in 1899. If you wanted to hear ragtime played at the 1904 World's Fair, you had to go to the Pike. And we know at least two places where important ragtime pioneers were playing. The Old St. Louis Beer Hall was where Louis Chauvin, the legendary ragtime piano player, was playing with his partner Sam Patterson. And the Spanish Café, where classic ragtime writer Arthur Marshall was playing piano. And if you didn't hear it on the Pike, you could repair to Market Street, and Market 22nd was the Rosebud Bar. And this is Tom Turpin's place, and Tom Turpin was the ragtime pioneer of St. Louis, and he operated the Rosebud from 1900 to 1907. This is where all the musicians gathered, including Scott Joplin. And he had a great year in 1904. In fact, he put up a Christmas tree advertised in this little paper that they put gifts on the tree for everybody that year because he had such a great year. Well, ragtime has been called the rock and roll of the 1890s. And, you know, it was the popular music of the day, and the city fathers looked down on the popular music, and they were afraid that it wasn't prestigious enough to program as a central part of the fair. So it was kept off the official programs. If you go through the program list, you can't find any ragtime listed at all. Yeah.
Can you describe how somebody would hear the ragtime on the Pike? I mean, was it like these kind of street corner performers, or were there like actual buildings where they could go in and hear it?
Yeah, actually, it would have been inside, because the nature of the ragtime art is it's in its best form. It's not exactly a chamber music, but close to it. And of course, these places were far from being what you would think of for chamber music. But these were bars. The Old St. Louis Beer Hall was a great big place, and Chauvin and Patterson had an act that involved piano duets, vocals, and cakewalk dancing and that kind of a thing. And Arthur Marshall actually didn't last long at the Spanish Café because there was a German band, I think, across the street that was so loud they had to let him go because nobody could hear him.
So did the general public know about Scott Joplin in 1904?
Scott Joplin was known as the king of ragtime writers. That was what his publisher John Stark always called him on his published sheets. And by 1904, he was a national figure, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Why was it then, if he was at least from the St. Louis area, that he wasn't involved?
Well, I don't think, you'd ask me why Joplin wasn't involved if he was nationally known, but there's still the prejudice against ragtime music. It was a fight here in St. Louis. There were always elements to try to keep it out. As late as 1909, there's an article in the Post-Dispatch, with a cartoon of the Muse throwing ragtime out of St. Louis. So there was always a struggle, and it was people who really knew and appreciated ragtime, and they were in the avant-garde really at the time.
Well, but they had it on the pike. I mean, if they had it, were the entertainers that were performing ragtime on the pike, were they invited to perform there, or did they just?
Okay, the entertainers on the pike were not of the national reputation. They were known locally. They were local legends. And Louis Chauvin won all the ragtime contests in this area, and his partner Sam Patterson had an act that they took on the road briefly. And but these were not well-known figures. These were just great local ragtime musicians. They were smart enough to hire ragtime because they knew people loved it. And the city fathers really lost out, I think.
Yeah.
Along the pike, there were all sorts of entertainments from different parts of the world, and this is always reflected on the sheet music covers. And most of the talent playing in these bars were local ragtime talent. And we know of two in the Spanish Cafe and the Old St. Louis Beer Hall. There were undoubtedly many others playing on the pike.
Do you think that this would have been an opportunity that maybe people had never heard ragtime before from around the world may have experienced it for the first time in St. Louis?
I think visitors to the St. Louis World's Fair, many of them probably experienced ragtime for the first time. I mean, really good ragtime if they knew where to find it. You had to go to the Rosebud or the Pike to hear the real, genuine article, you know. And certainly all the expositions, especially the St. Louis exposition, played a great role in spreading the gospel of ragtime. They were very important because they brought a lot of musicians in town too. And Jelly Roll Morton talked about a ragtime piano competition that was held off the fairgrounds that he was going to enter until he found out about a rival pianist he was afraid of, so he didn't enter. And it turned out this rival didn't enter, and a pianist won from New Orleans by the name of Alfred Wilson, and Morton was really put out about that because he could have beat Wilson, he said. But that's all we know about it, you know. But there was a contest held. Earlier in the year, in February, the Turpin brothers of the Rosebud held their own piano competition at the Beaumont Hall, and Louis Chauvin was the winner, the legendary St. Louis player. Okay, some of the legendary talents you could have heard in St. Louis along the Pike or at the Rosebud would have been Tom Turpin, of course, Louis Chauvin, who was considered the greatest player in St. Louis, and Arthur Marshall, who was a protege of Scott Joplin's. Joplin may have visited the fair, but there's no evidence he played or was featured there. Sam Patterson, who's a much lesser known name, but who was a partner of Louis Chauvin's. Joe Jordan, who was a very fine ragtime pianist who became well known as a music arranger and composer later, and who wrote the tune that put over Fanny Brice, Lovey Joe, way back in the Ziegfeld Follies, I think in 1907. So there's quite a bit of talent people could hear, either at the Pike or the Rosebud. Yeah, these were the true pioneers. You start with Tom Turpin, really laid the groundwork, and of course Scott Joplin, and Louis Chauvin, who was the most brilliant player. And these were the true creative geniuses who laid the foundation for American popular music. Mm-hmm.
That was nice. Very nice. Anything else?
What impact did the 1904 World's Fair have on ragtime?
Yeah, we already talked a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Bringing the players together is the main thing.
Did it help? Did it help sort of further popularize it?
I think to some extent, but here again, you're working with an underground thing, you know, ragtime on the Pike. You know, it wasn't a big feature of the official program.
Uh-huh.
But I think the expos were important because a lot of talent came to town, and the musicians exchanged ideas, and this is always important for the growth of an art form, especially in the early years.
So it maybe helped foster creativity?
Yes, definitely, I think so. The 1904 World's Fair was important in developing the ragtime art in its early days because it brought together talents from all over the country. So this spurred a lot of creativity, exchange of ideas, and it was important because these were the true pioneers of the American popular music form. The reason we call it the first original popular American music is it started the idea of a continuously syncopated melody. And this idea carried over into popular music, subsequent popular music. And the rags, the greatest rags that were so well written, like the Joplin pieces, really lent a lot of formal musical principles and construction and ideas and to subsequent music. And the best example is Jelly Roll Morton, who was a transitional figure, who drew on the structure and ideas of the rags and then added his own improvisations to bring it into jazz.
Is it too big of a stretch to say even something like, and you and I are probably not experts on hip-hop, for instance.
No.
But is it too much of a stretch to say that the syncopation of ragtime carried into the development of jazz,
Yeah.
and that you could really argue that the patterns of, you know, even today's popular music like hip-hop essentially draw their roots all the way back to ragtime?
Yeah, some of the musical ideas that we hear throughout the various developments and stylistic changes in American music traced right back to rags, especially things like riffs, repeated rhythmic patterns that became popular in jazz. Joplin was using them in his rags before 1910. So the syncopations, the patterns, pretty basically the same. Yeah.